It's me. Hello, everybody. Good evening. So thanks, Brandon, for the introduction and also for the information that you've shared, because in fact, this first slide is kind of indicative of what you've been saying, that Neolife's mission is to make the world a healthier and a happier place. And, the way we're going to do that is to actually end the trend of poor health and poverty. That's a big part of our mission. And you'll see that this sort of graphic is actually really just put there to show you how all of that is interlinked. Our health, poverty, and our well-being is all interlinked. And when I look at these different circles, I've put them interlinked with one another because very often we look at these conditions of obesity, diabetes, and heart health, and these are diseases of lifestyle. You know, we're not talking, although we're talking about conditions, we're not a company that is treating diseases, but they come our way and we can't actually ignore them because they are part of our lifestyle choices and they are as a result of our lifestyle choices. So obesity, diabetes, heart health, and some of the others that Brandon mentioned are all interrelated. They're not independent of one another, although we tend to talk of them like that. And tonight I want to hopefully show you how interrelated they all are. So I guess the purpose of saying that is really that our health and our lifestyle has to be looked at holistically. We have to, nothing is independent, one thing from the other. And I'm sure you'll agree that we are providing solutions to global trends, particularly those of you who are familiar with Neolife. And of course, our scientific advisory board are the group who are actually doing that. And they are ensuring that we actually do change these solutions. I'm just trying to get my slides to. The slides won't seem to move. Oh, there we are. Okay. So our scientific advisory board, who are world-renowned scientists and who in turn work with a global science network, behind the scenes, are the people who have actually formulated many products relating to lifestyle conditions, trying to get the education out there, trying to make an impact, filling dietary gaps. That's really our job. So we are going to nature, to food, recognizing what the body needs and recognizing, in fact, what is commonly known, that people are not eating the right sort of things. And so we're trying to fill those gaps. So tonight we're going to look at that sort of aspect, but we're also going to do it in the context of a really exciting new product that we've introduced into our market, which is Botanical Balance. And you'll see there that we're using modern science, as I've talked about our scientists. And of course, though, we go back to nature, we go back to what humans are used to, we're combining ancient wisdom, foods that should be part of our intake, sometimes things that we've forgotten. So we're going back and combining all those things together. So why are we calling it Botanical Balance? Well, it's because we're using selected botanicals in this particular product. Botanicals are plants, herbs, spices, and what we're balancing is our blood glucose activity and levels. And there I've just put on the slide, just so that the terminology is familiar. We're going to use the word blood glucose or blood sugar, and they're interchangeable. They're the same thing. Insulin is the hormone that is related to them. And then, of course, we always talk about cellular nutrition. So we have to get that insulin and glucose to relate to one another and get them to the cells, because that's what you and I are made of. And certainly as distributors in our business, we always talk about nutrition at the cellular level. And we're going to talk about that a lot this evening. And it'll be quite interesting to see how it all comes together, particularly with this product. So I just want to remind you of very familiar graphics that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. We always talk about the cell, the fact that it needs to be healthy. We ensure that it is healthy by using the right nutrients. And then, of course, the little graphic below that is talking about our blood sugar levels, because I made reference to that. And pretty much, I guess, when you prick your finger, if you go for a test, what the doctor's looking for is something within the range of that blue wave that you see. That means you're on a good controlled process in terms of your blood sugar. We're trying to avoid spikes and troughs like you can see with the slightly red, the red graph. So that's the sort of context that we're going to work in tonight. And so we've been doing the cellular information and regulating our blood sugars for many years. It's something we're very well known for. And we have products that are excellent in making sure that our cells are responsive to the nutrients that need to go into them, because that is actually often where the problem starts, right at the level of the cell. We don't have to make it any more complicated than that. And so we've recognized that 60 years ago, and we've put products together that people use the right oils, the omega-3s, omega-6s, various lipids and sterols to make that orange circle nice and bold, but actually pretty flexible so that those green arrows can go into the cell and bring the nutrients that are needed. But we've also been very, very aware, and this was again many years ago, that we realized that people's blood sugar levels were going up and down and causing a lot of chaos in our bodies and of course in our health. And that is why some of these disease profiles have increased. So we've brought out products, and all of these have been researched. Many of them have been published. So what we're talking about here is well-known information on a nutritional level, but the products themselves have been tested to see that they perform about the things I've been talking about. So this is familiar, and these are the products that people are already using, but we're going to add to this concept to show you how important we can even be more specific about these two graphics. So keeping those graphics in mind, let's look at them in an animated way, which I think that just makes the story come to life a bit. And I'm going to be very simplistic, not to try and talk down to anyone, but I think it just makes it easier. We talked about glucose, we talked about insulin, I've made reference to the cell and to the little parking spot that you can see, or gateway to the cell. And just to get the image right in your mind, the glucose, which are those green dots, and the insulin, which are the orange dots, the relationship of the two, one to the other, is really what's crucial about what we're going to talk about tonight. But what you can notice is that they're the same number of green dots as there are orange dots. And that's very important because that's what keeps the balance. The glucose, or the green dots, if you like, are as a result of what we've eaten. So in Neo Life, we talk about the different stages of nutrition. So our diet, or what we eat, is the first stage. We then digest it. We then have to absorb it. And then we have to get to circulate it. But as we digest it, that food eventually becomes glucose, which we then circulate in the blood. So we're now at the stage of circulation. And now what we want, the next stage, is to get that glucose into the cell, which is now called assimilation. So we're at the 5th stage of our level of nutrition. So when we take that food in, and we bring those green dots, if you like, into our bloodstream, we then ask our body to make the orange dots. So it has to make them in relation to what we've eaten. That's very important. So the more glucose or green dots we load into our bloodstream, the more insulin or orange dots we ask our body to make. And very often that's where the imbalance comes in, or the overload, if you like, can come in. So just bear that in mind as we talk along this evening. So the relationship of the two is when we've swallowed the food and it's got into the bloodstream, the insulin picks it up. So we have glucose uptake, or a relationship between the two, takes it to the cell, to the little parking spot, which now is dependent on the quality of the cell membrane. That little parking spot has to be well oiled, it has to be available so that the insulin can dock with it and then deliver its goods. And that's how we get glucose that we've eaten, got into our bloodstream, out of the bloodstream, and into our cell, and that's where the activity or cellular activity starts to happen. So that's kind of an animated version of our cellular nutrition story, which I think is quite a nice little one. Right, so that makes, we talked about glucose, insulin, so I think that makes us think a little bit about diabetes. So let's talk about that for a minute and just see what is actually happening around the world in terms of this condition, because Brandon made reference to all these lifestyle diseases and how they're on the increase. And just look at this picture. I mean, 1 death every 8 seconds related to diabetes or the side effects of diabetes in our bodies. And the picture is really not a good one at all. In fact, it's a very worrying one, because in the next 20, 25 years, it's on the increase all around the world. But in Africa, we're leading the charge. I mean, 143% increase in the incidence of diabetes is expected in the next 25 years, which is very worrying. But you might notice there that 60% of adults with diabetes are unaware they have it. And that's also seems a little strange, and in fact, according to the International Diabetic Federation, the African region has the highest percentage of undiagnosed people of all the regions around the world. So we live in Africa, and we have a job to do, and we have a job to educate people and to make a difference so that this number just doesn't get completely out of hand, which pretty much is already. So with this in mind, let's go forward and see what it is we can do about this and how we can help. bearing in mind that we're not here to treat the diseases. We're here to look at the foods and the nutrients that will fill the gaps or help the body use its own biochemistry, to an optimal level. So what is diabetes? Just, in a definition. Well, yes, it's a chronic condition, and yes, it's related to insulin and glucose. So the body loses its ability to produce or to properly use. So it may produce it, but it doesn't properly use it. And that's the hormone insulin when it's trying to regulate the glucose level. So it's the relationship between those green dots and those orange dots. The orange being the insulin and the glucose with the green dots. It's that relationship we're trying to keep balanced. And that's our biochemistry we're trying to balance. Just very briefly, just so that we know, there are different types of diabetes. And in fact, even between these two, type 1 and type 2, there are other types as well. But just most of us will encounter the type 1, which is generally something that we get as children, and it's an autoimmune condition. The body, for some reason, starts to fight with itself, and it affects the way the pancreas works. It breaks down those cells till eventually the body doesn't produce any insulin of its own. So it doesn't produce any of those orange dots that we want it to do. So there's nothing we can do to change that specifically. We then have to take the insulin from an external source. So we're not really going to work specifically with this group. We have to be much more cautious with them, although we can certainly enable them with certain nutrients, but we're going to focus more on the type 2, because you'll see there, 90% of the cases we're going to encounter around the world. And that's where the increase is coming, is in the type 2 camp. And here people are able to make insulin. They are able to make those orange dots, but eventually they start to make varying amounts of them, or they might make the insulin. The quality of the insulin sometimes isn't good. So that's the group of people that we're trying to make a difference with, or to influence, but we're not treating their condition and we're not taking the place of their medication. We're simply bringing in nutrients that enable their body's biochemistry to be more sensitive. And then, of course, what does happen during pregnancy is that some women's blood sugar levels do fluctuate somewhat, and they then call it gestational diabetes. It usually remedies itself at the end of the pregnancy, but it is a bit of a red flag to say, just be cautious, because maybe you are susceptible. And so in your food choices and in your lifestyle choices, just be aware that, you need to be concerned about this. Okay, so since we were talking diabetes, let's just look at some of the risk factors related to why it actually happens and how we set ourselves up for it. So not all of it, sometimes there is a genetic predisposition, and that in itself is something that was a bit like the pregnancy. It's happened, so it's a red flag. So if it is in the family, or is somewhere in the sort of extended family, then be aware of it. So that means that, make lifestyle choices that aren't going to make you more susceptible. But then, of course, being overweight, and you saw that in one of the rings that I had in the beginning of one of the first slides, they're all interrelated. And that, of course, being overweight and to the level of obesity is a huge problem in the Western world. It's a massive problem in South Africa, for example. And I'm afraid to say that the ladies are doing worse than the men, but a very high percentage of our population is considered overweight, and in many cases obese. And of course, I think we can see there, our diet certainly isn't that desirable, and it does definitely contribute in a big way. And then when we're slouching around watching TV and having that diet, we're not really doing ourselves a favor. But that is, that's a lifestyle choice that we make. Our nutritional, what we eat is a lifestyle choice. If we are active or inactive is a choice we make. So that's why we have to look at this holistically and realize that it's not just one thing that we do and we take a tablet and it sorts us out. We have to look at the whole picture of the choices that we make. Right, so just a little bit of background without being technical, but some of you will have these questions and they've come my way already. So what happens before we get to the type 2 diabetes? We throw around words like insulin resistance or pre-diabetes. And right in the beginning, I made a comment that 60% of people are moving around in their normal daily lives unaware that they are setting themselves up for diabetes. And that almost seems ridiculous, because how can you be unaware of a condition? But it's a process. And so it often starts with insulin resistance. Now, picturing that cell again, the cells are not responding well to insulin. They're becoming resistant to their insulin for various reasons. And so the body can't, or the cell can't easily take up the glucose The insulin isn't taking it out of the blood and dropping it into the cell. So we have become, if you like, resistant to our insulin. And there are all sorts of different reasons that, there could be a variety of different things. One of them that we would understand and is well accepted is that if the cell membrane is not in good condition, it's not fluid and receptive and responsive, then our insulin, that little parking spot's not going to be as receptive to the insulin. And so that whole process that you saw in that animation is not going to work effectively. Stress can also cause, stress is also giving off a hormone, cortisol. Remember, insulin's a hormone. And they're very powerful things, they're messengers. So the stress hormone that we give off actually is antagonistic to insulin. So if we've got very high levels of stress on a sustained basis, that can actually affect the way our insulin works. So maybe that's why in some cases insulin isn't responding to the cell and the cell isn't responding to insulin, and we're not getting the picture that we should be getting of green dots and orange dots getting together and depositing the glucose into the cell. Smoking tends to affect the ability of insulin to work at optimal level. And of course, being inactive doesn't incentivize the cell to say, well, I need this glucose, please bring it to me. So it doesn't sensitize itself very well to receiving glucose because it really has no interest. We're just slouching around, doing no exercise, not being active. There's no incentive for the cell to do that. So what happens, excuse me, is that because the insulin, the orange dots, are not making the glucose go into the cell, the brain is saying to the body, there's glucose in the blood, get it out of the blood, get it into a cell. So it instructs the pancreas, which makes the insulin, to make more insulin in an attempt to help. But it's not working. So in fact, as much insulin as you can have around is not getting that glucose into the cell. So the brain says, get it out of the blood. So it says, make some more insulin. And so this whole cycle just gets worse and worse. The pancreas is working like crazy, producing more insulin on instruction, but the two are just not coming together. The insulin is not working properly, so the glucose is not getting out of the blood. Obviously, initially, it will work a little. There will be some activity, and you'll find that the insulin will eventually will make some headway, and it will get some of that glucose into the cell. So at that stage, you might find that, in fact, even if one tested one's blood sugar, it might be slightly elevated for a little bit longer, but it's not really an issue. And so there are usually no obvious symptoms. One doesn't really experience this because the body is trying to do its work for you. It's trying to accommodate. But meanwhile, there's a lot of chaos that's starting to happen here. But there are consequences to this sort of level of disease that is not really happening properly. Some of the conditions that seem to happen when we do have this insulin resistance, where our insulin is not working properly and our glucose is taking longer than it should to get into the cell. Sometimes this affects our ability to regulate our blood pressure, for example. It seems to cause the body to retain salt, and that in turn increases our blood volume, and that in turn increases our blood pressure. Our cholesterol, insulin being around like this and being resistant to our own insulin, tends to cause us to produce more of the undesirable cholesterol rather than the desirable one. So we create imbalances in our fat levels in the body, in our bloodstream. It certainly affects our ability to lose weight because insulin is hanging around more than it should. There's more in the blood than needs to be there. Can you see there's an imbalance? And it's a fat storer. It gives the message to store fat. So we might be finding that we're actually not able to lose weight because possibly we're insulin resistant. Interestingly, in some people, it also creates an increase in uric acid, which is responsible for gout. So some people who have gout might in fact be insulin resistant, but they're not necessarily aware of the relationship. That's why I'm saying there are no obvious symptoms that you know about insulin resistance. Sometimes we're simply getting the consequences of it. Also inflammation. Our fat cell, if we're developing more fat cells, we're producing fat inflammation markers, and that inflammation is all around the body. And that in itself is not a desirable set of circumstances, particularly for disease patterns. So this is the very first stage that happens. And as I say, there are various reasons that I've mentioned before, but there are also some consequences. But our blood sugar levels may actually be okay when we actually test them. Then we get beyond that a little now because our pancreas has been working so hard. Remember, it's the producer of that insulin. It's been getting these messages to keep on providing insulin because the process is not working well. So it gets tired, it gets fatigued. And it still tries very hard to make its insulin. It might make less and less insulin as it goes along, or because it's being asked and demanded of so much, it's making a poor quality of insulin. So that compounds the problem even more. So we're now in a sort of pre-diabetic state. And this is still the group of 60% of people who don't realize that they're setting themselves up for diabetes, or in fact may even be right at the point. So our blood sugar levels go higher, and they stay higher for longer because our insulin is not working as efficiently. So that little green dot, orange dot relationship is not working, and the cell membrane is not receiving properly. But it's still not high enough to be diagnosed as a diabetic. So can you see how much warning we actually get and how much work our body's doing? And this can go on for 5-7 years without us actually realizing it. And then at some point, we might get some symptoms. We don't always get obvious ones, but sometimes, for example, our eyes might, for example, get a bit blurred. Because the reason for that is because this glucose that's hanging around in the blood is attaching itself to proteins in the body, in the bloodstream, on the blood vessels, and it gets to behind the eyes, it gets into the kidneys, it affects some of the fats. So it creates a lot of damage without us really realizing it. And at some point, these symptoms eventually become apparent, and then we get our blood sugar checked as well as our cholesterol and our blood pressure. At this point, in fact, we could even have blood pressure and cholesterol, and that's why they all link together. And then eventually it may be diagnosed as a condition of diabetes. But we're interested in making a difference at this level. In fact, we're hoping people don't get to these situations because we'd like to help the body, the biochemistry of the body, with foods and nutrients that help it to work more efficiently and sensitively, which is why we brought out this product here. So you can start to see we're balancing our blood glucose levels using certain botanicals or plants or foods, and we're wanting to manage this glucose uptake. We want to optimize the sensitivity of our insulin to our cell membrane. And we want to maximize that parking spot so that all those three activities work together. So I hope that looks a little complicated, but I hope I've just shown you that that picture works. So just to remind ourselves, we want to manage the glucose uptake because it's in the bloodstream. We want to optimize our insulin sensitivity. Insulin takes it to the cell membrane. We want to make sure that that little receptor, or the parking spot, if you like, is functioning properly. And then we want to make sure that that process happens. So those three statements there are actually this picture in action. That's what we want to help the body do. And I've just been giving you a little bit of background about how that can get completely out of balance, and it doesn't happen. And I mentioned that when it's uncontrolled and that blood sugar level is rising and it's staying in the blood longer than it should, then it starts to react, as I mentioned, with body proteins and fats. And that causes oxidation and inflammation that I think most of us are familiar with those terms now. But they're not desirable things to happen in the body, and we need to combat them because they really are the evil twins, and they create a lot of damaging activity in our body. And they are fertilizer, if you like, for disease. They just enable it to get to the next step. So we've talked about the balance. Now let's talk about the botanical, because we've put together a very unique natural whole food source of botanicals: cinnamon, curcumin, and turmeric. And this is some ancient wisdom that I was talking about, because these spices have been around for centuries. Many of us don't use them in our day-to-day cooking, and if we do, we use very little. So we're trying to bring them into the dietary pattern that we have on a regular basis, because interestingly, they make a huge difference to this balance that we're trying to achieve. So let's just look at them briefly individually. Now, cinnamon is probably the most well-researched. I mean, there have been human studies done to find that, in fact, cinnamon manages to regulate glucose metabolism, help us regulate our blood sugar. It's not a medication, it's a food, but I think you'll agree that we don't eat a lot of cinnamon, even if we enjoy it. It's usually just a sprinkling on things that we make or bake, and we're not getting it on a regular basis. And it's been well researched to know, as I say, that it regulates glucose metabolism. But what we're saying is it helps with insulin production, because remember I said the pancreas gets tired. And it also makes sure that we are sensitive to our insulin, that our cell membrane will actually react to it positively. So just little cinnamon is amazing what it can actually do in this whole process that could get very out of balance. And we're trying to fine tune it and help our bodies, work with our own biochemistry. When we bring this in, this is what it does for us. So it promotes the uptake of our glucose, because it's making sure that glucose and insulin and the cell membrane are all working together. So a very important ingredient in our blend. And then turmeric and curcumin are one and the same plant. Curcumin comes from the turmeric root. And these are traditional spices that have been around for centuries. And there's quite a lot of research to show that they actually also contribute to glucose metabolism and balance. But what they're very well known for is being antioxidants and anti-inflammatory agents. Now, I told you that even when glucose is slightly elevated, left to its own devices, moving around in the bloodstream when it should actually be inside a cell, it becomes destructive. Remember, I said it actually starts attaching itself to the proteins, and those are all around the body, but very much in our blood vessels. So it starts to affect our circulation and, of course, general heart health. So it also affects the fats and starts to denature them and to oxidize them. So we need antioxidants and anti-inflammatory agents to prevent the side effects, if you like, of what's happening to people's bodies while we're trying to fine-tune it. So not a lot of ingredients, but very, very powerful and very, very targeted for what I showed you when I showed you that picture and how things can deteriorate. And here we're giving you ingredients to sharpen them up and to combat the negative effects until we've got it finely balanced. But then we've also added some additional ingredients, very important ones. Now, chromium, for example, something our body needs very specifically for blood sugar control, insulin relationships. We need it, we can't make it in our body, so we have to get it from our diet. And so we are making sure that we are contributing it to your diet because it's an essential cofactor with insulin, very important for the way we simply metabolize foods, and making sure that our cells are responsive to the insulin so that our little bit of insulin can dock on the cell, get through the parking spot, take the glucose into the cell, as you saw in that little graphic. And another ingredient that is, I think, well, it's certainly new to our range of products, alpha-lipoic acid, but is not foreign to the body at all. In fact, it's present in every cell in the body, but it's a very, very powerful antioxidant, a very, very powerful protector, but it also works in its, it has a good relationship with the way the body uses insulin. So I think you can see that we are trying to just make this relationship of the green dots and the orange dots and the cell membranes and the cell itself all talk to each other all the time on a regular basis so that we don't end up getting to the insulin resistant stage, the pre-diabetic stage, and we definitely won't wanting to avoid people getting to the diabetic stage. But those numbers that you saw are not very favorable, and we've really got to make a difference. We really have a responsibility to make sure that we can help people do this. And we have the knowledge and we have the product. But it all sounds good. How do we know it works? You know, is this going to make a difference? Well, in usual Neo-Life style, we've done the research. We've put our product to the test, as we have with many of our others. And that research gets published and it becomes available to the scientific community in general. So we've only just, this is a relatively new product, and so we've done some new studies and we're still busy doing studies. So one of the aspects that we did, we actually took a group of young adults who were healthy individuals. We're not just, remember, we're looking to try and prevent here. We're trying to see what this product will do, even on a healthy level. And we found that these youngsters were sort of in their, late teens, 20s, up to about 30. And we gave them the product. Actually, just for they took it the night before the test and then the day of the test, prior to them eating those 2 meals. And we found that, in fact, we improved a glucose relationship with the insulin. Now, you'll notice there's a green line, then it says glucose balance. Glucose balance and botanical balance are the same product. It's just that in different markets, we use a different name, and that's purely a regulatory requirement, nothing we're able to change. So we've called it botanical balance in Africa, and in other parts of the world, in America, they happen to call it glucose balance. So that's what the product is. So you'll see there the placebo then is giving the participants in the study a product that looks like the glucose balance, but it's got no active ingredients. And so then we're going to compare one group against the other. So we do what we call an oral glucose tolerance test. So we give them a load of glucose, green dots in other words, gets into their bloodstream. And then when they've taken the product or they've taken the placebo, they we then to see what relationship the insulin and the glucose has with the cell. And so you'll see there that in fact, this was actually what was interesting. It showed that they were less hungry. So in fact, they didn't have any spikes in their sugar. They weren't suddenly elevated and suddenly hungry. Didn't have that sort of up and down that we often have with our sugar levels. It was a moderate use of the glucose. They swallowed the glucose, their bodies responded very favorably, and it kept them happy and satisfied, if you like, for much longer than the group who didn't take the glucose balance or botanical balance. They started getting hungrier much quicker. So their bodies gulped up the glucose, whereas those that took the product actually took it, the insulin and the glucose and the cell membrane all worked together in a very moderate, sensible way with no spikes and no drops in their sugar, so that they felt satisfied for longer. So 30, 60, and 90 minutes, we did these tests. So that was interesting, just a very short, just a one-day test really. And these were healthy individuals that already their body was responding positively. But what I want to say about healthy individuals is that it doesn't mean that because you take this product that it's going to drop your blood sugar lower than it should be. It simply won't influence it negatively. It will simply ensure that there's a sensitivity of one component to the other. It's not going to suddenly drop your blood sugar if you are at a normal level. That's what food does. Then we took it a step further and we did a slightly longer study, a 3-month study, in fact, with an older group of participants, well up until their sort of 80s actually. And here you'll see when I show you the graph that there was a response, a positive response in their glucose curve. In other words, it was regulated. Interestingly also, there was a positive effect on the blood fat levels. Remember I said that when our sugar is hanging around, or glucose in the blood, it starts to damage our blood levels, and fat levels rather, and it oxidizes them, and that causes inflammation, and that in itself contributes to other disease problems. So it had a positive effect on the blood fats in their diet and in their system. And then an interesting thing, which we anticipated would happen, but it was great to see it actually happen, because our brain is very dependent on glucose too. And so it actually enhanced our cognitive functions in this particular group. The effect on their memory, for example, they could recall information much more positively. Their mood was more constant, they were more focused, and there was a degree of stress reduction in this particular group. So if we look at the graph, as I said, this was a 3-month test or study, and this was all very professionally done. This was an oral glucose tolerance test. In other words, they had to do tests prior to coming. They were selected for this group, and they were actually a generally healthy group. They weren't diabetics. They were just an elderly group of people that they had used for this test, and they had to be tested before, and then they had to come in each month and have their glucose tested again with this. This oral glucose tolerance test gives you, as I say, a load of glucose, and that gets put straight into the bloodstream, and then they test you at various intervals, right up until about 2 to 3 hours after you've actually taken the load of glucose. And here you'll see, again, the green one is the product, and the orange one is the group of people, same age group, just both taking the test, but some were taking the product and some weren't. And those that weren't taking the product, you can actually see that their blood sugar levels went much higher, and they stayed elevated for a much longer period of time and then dropped off quite sharply. Those who took the product, yes, their blood sugar went up. Of course it should. It's like putting petrol in your car. That's the reason why you eat. It's for energy. So it's intended to go up, but it's the way it behaves once it's in the bloodstream. And you can see there it was very constant, and it slowly tapered off, as it should, once we'd used it up and it got into the cell, and then we'd need to eat again. So this is the performance of the product. And as I said also, we had it affected the blood fats very positively as well. The triglycerides in particular dramatically reduced in this 2 to 3 month period. The cholesterol levels were slightly managed, but they didn't go up and they didn't go down dramatically. But in general, our fat profile, if you went and had a cholesterol test, would have actually reflected a positive result. So as I said, we got more than just glucose balance out of this. We got a lot of other components as well. So this truly is an amazing combination of ingredients. As you can see, it's 5 ingredients that we've combined together in just the right concentrations to make this difference to the human body. And of course, we've challenged it by putting it to the test. And we were actually invited to present this information at the American Society of Nutrition, which we did now in June 2020. They had a virtual conference, and we were invited as a company to go and present this information to a scientific community. So that's the kind of level of assistance that you're actually getting, filling dietary gaps, but making sure that they make a difference. It's not just talk, it's actually performance that we're actually talking about here. Right, so who should we be talking to about botanical balance, having looked at all those things? Well, pretty much anyone eating a Western diet, which is just about anyone you're going to meet. And because of it, as I showed you about insulin resistance, the pre-diabetic state, and the results of insulin resistance, anyone who's overweight, has high blood pressure and high cholesterol, is likely to be in this camp that needs to have balance in their blood glucose levels. And we're going to meet a lot of these people. And as I said, you can see that insulin resistance, for example, might even be the reason why they have high blood pressure or perhaps high cholesterol. But we're not going out looking for diseases as such. But I wanted to point out to you that those rings that I showed you in the beginning are interrelated. And this is how it happens. And if someone, and there are many people who don't take these conditions seriously, and they don't look to their weight, they just take a medication, but they've learned nothing about what they should be eating. And I can almost guarantee you that if they don't take this high blood pressure, overweight, and cholesterol seriously, then blood sugar medication is going to be the next thing attached to that statement. And anyone who's already been advised to watch their blood sugar levels, in other words, it's already been picked up. We've got probably from the insulin resistant stage to the pre-diabetic stage, and there've been perhaps some symptoms. So they've been told, your blood sugar levels are a little bit high, staying high for too long. Just keep an eye on what you're eating. That's generally the advice that's given from their doctor. Of course, people tend not to do that because, nothing's really threatening them at the moment. Those are the people that we want to be able to say, let's have a look at it. Let's help you balance it out. And then, of course, you're going to meet the type 2 diabetic. We're not going out looking for them. We don't want to go out there. We're not treating people's diseases. We are inevitably going to meet them. And we are trying to bring these food ingredients into their dietary component so that they can actually have a much more sensitive biochemistry. But if we meet them, we can certainly assist them in helping the body to work the way it should. So I think you'll agree that we definitely are providing solutions to global trends and how interrelated these particular conditions are. And we need to take ourselves seriously in what we eat, in our lifestyle choices. And we've heard it so many times before, the things we're supposed to eat, do a little bit of exercise. We've heard all that sort of thing before, and we don't take it seriously. But as you've realized now, your cell membrane and your cell in general, if you exercise, you're actually incentivizing it to ask for that glucose. You're actually making it more sensitive to that insulin glucose barking spot balance that I was talking about. Just because you are asking it to give you energy because you're exercising. If you don't exercise, there's no incentive for your cell membrane to be sensitive. There's no incentive for it to want to lure the glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cell. So while we hear, as I said, we become insensitive to advice that we're given, as I say, exercise regularly, eat the fiber, eat the diet, get good sleep. All those things contribute to a balanced body. So the way we recommend that the botanical balance gets taken is 2 tablets twice a day before the 2 largest meals, because it's directly related to that biochemistry, the relationship of what you eat, how you get it out of the bloodstream and into the cell. You decide which are your largest meals. Those are the ones that are going to dominate bloodstream in terms of glucose. And then you choose to take your tablets related to your eating pattern. And we're recommending, as I say, 2 twice a day. So that container has got 120 tablets, so that's a month's supply that you're going to get from the product. So I think that when you look at all our products, as many of you are taking many of them, and you might be saying, well, you know what, I've got everything under control. I'm sure that everything I'm taking is probably enough. Just think about the ingredients that I talked about. Other than chromium, all the other ingredients, the cinnamon, the turmeric, the curcumin, and the alpha-lipoic acid, are not in any of these other products. So it's a very, very important and powerful ally to the things that we are already taking within the Neolife range. So it's a great additional weapon to help you and others that you're going to meet stay in charge of your blood glucose. And I think at this point, the questions that have been coming along is, well, if I'm on medication, can I take the product? Now, it's not my place or Neolife's place to talk about people's prescription medications and things. But if someone is a type 2 diabetic, very commonly, or they're in that sort of pre-diabetic state, They're very commonly given glucophage or metformin as the ingredient because it is very effective. Excuse me, it is very effective at glucose uptake. That's part of its job, and also to prevent the liver from making more glucose when it's not getting into the cell. It tries to compensate by making glucose itself and producing it and providing it to the body. It regulates that process. So can I take the products together? Yes, you can, because after all, these are just foods. However, I would suggest that it's going to happen whereby, because the product works, you saw that from the research, it may well, lower your blood glucose a little bit because it's making the body more sensitive and it's working as well as your, in conjunction with your medication. So be aware that maybe your blood glucose levels actually go down a little because that's what we're actually trying to achieve. And I would suggest that you mention it to your doctor and say that you're taking this, so that, or keep a record of your own blood sugar. I mean, that's the most intelligent thing to do. Keep a record of your blood sugar. And when you see that it's actually improving, you can go and talk with your doctor, and he's much more, she is much more likely to work with you if they can see some results, if your record will actually give them the results. So we don't tell people to stop taking their medication. That's not our job. We're trying to sensitize the body. But when the two are working together, you probably are going to get a very good result. If you're type 1 diabetic who is on insulin, remember I said they don't make any insulin, so they don't have the little orange dots to be able to draw on. They've actually got to take that externally. We don't mess, we can give them the product, no problem, because it's going to help the body in general. It's going to be a good antioxidant, good anti-inflammatory agent. But we don't want to mess with their insulin levels. Remember, they are having to balance their external insulin intake with their external food intake. And they generally, it takes a long time to get that balance right. So it's not for us to say, change your insulin levels or stop. You can't tell them to stop taking their medication. So we're really more interested in people who are a little out of balance, perhaps, as I say, overweight, setting themselves up for possibly getting to a pre-diabetic and diabetic stage. They're overweight, perhaps their blood sugar, their blood cholesterol is a little high, their blood pressure's out of balance. That's the sort of candidate where we're trying to say, come on, let's try and help your body. But people can certainly take the product when they're taking the medication, but discuss it with their doctor. Also during pregnancy, again, this is going to be helpful. However, that's not our place. We don't know any about the circumstances of the situation. So encourage people to understand what the product can do for them. It is only food nutrients after all, but they should discuss that with their doctor because we don't know the individual circumstances. So I think that's what I'd like to share with you today. The information, I know it's been a bit of a mouthful, but I think some of these, the reason why I've mentioned some of these things is because some of the questions have come up about insulin resistance and pre-diabetics and how come 60% of people are walking around and they don't know that they're setting themselves up for diabetes. It's because the body is so accommodating and it's trying to balance all the time for us. Even when we are creating havoc for it, you can see it's constantly trying to balance, but eventually it gets to the tipping point where it isn't able to balance for you anymore. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with Botanical Balance. We're trying to help you with those botanicals achieve that balance. So that's me, Brandon. I think you wanted to share some information about details of the product, how to get hold of it, etc.
Wow, thank you very much, Liz. That was just powerful.